I'm gonna start that now. So Doug Stone is native from California, where he started his botanical journey working on native species in California, which, if you know the flora of California, that is awesome. It's one of those places outside of the tropics that is really, truly remarkable for its biodiversity. And then he went to UC Berkeley, where he did his PhD working on Olisbioideae, or what was at the time family Memphis, or whether or not that was a different family. Then he went to Uppsala for a postdoc, continued that type of work, and then eventually made it to KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where he's still affiliated. Even though he's still affiliated with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Doug now is sort of more permanently based back in California. If you look at the amount of people that have worked both in Asia and the neotropics on Melastomataceae, it's a long list, but the list in Africa is very short. And in fact, the list from 1990s, from the 1990s to about 5 years ago, is probably Doug and two other people. And both of them working with Doug. So I know that the work he will be presenting today is a collaborative effort, but it's, I think, appropriate for the fact that he's been working in the family in the continent for over 20 years now. So Doug, take it away, and thank you so much for being here today and volunteering to give this.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fabian, and it's really a pleasure. Good morning, or good afternoon or evening, I think, as the case may be, to everyone attending. And thanks for your interest in hearing my talk on African melastomes. So I just want to give you an outline of my talk. I'll first give an introduction to the Olisbioideae, that is the group that includes Memphis and relatives, and go into some recent work on the African diversity in this group. And then I'll continue talking about some ongoing work of mine on Memphis of Madagascar. This started some years ago when I was a postdoc at California Academy of Sciences, and it's ongoing. It turned out to be a much bigger project than I ever imagined. And I like to think that the fact that it's taking as long as it is going to make it a lot better than it would have been if I had tried to get it done earlier. And then lastly, I'd like to talk about some recent work on the molecular systematics and a revised classification of Disotis and allies, the African members of the tribe Melastomataceae. And here I want to give a big shout out to my colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Marie-Claire Veranzo-Libala and Professor Dr. Gudrun Kattereit. So, you know, I was very idealistic and naive when I started this business. And it may be true that I'm still a bit idealistic and naive, but all along I've been motivated by a strong desire to make a contribution to our knowledge of tropical plants. For the past 20 years or so, I've been studying the systematics and evolution of the Olisbioideae, a woody group that includes the species-rich paleotropical Memphis and 5 other genera. Wait, are these even melastomes? They don't really look like melastomes. The members of this group have very hard wood, opposite estipulate evergreen leaves. In Memphis, the leaves are apparently one-nerved, which is very odd, and small flowers, and then a berry-like fruit containing a single large seed. As you can see in Memphis, the embryo is extensively leafy and convoluted. So they don't look too much like melastomes, do they? Another very peculiar characteristic of Memphis flowers is their enlarged anther connectives, often bearing a conspicuous gland on the dorsal side, as shown in this flower of Memphis amshafi from Cameroon. The secretion from these glands is rich in fatty oils, and the flowers may be pollinated by oil collecting bees. But this is a wide open area of study. It would be very interesting to do some pollination studies on these plants. This is a sample from another Memphis genus, Warneckia. And here is sort of the first tip-off that these plants might actually be melastomes. So in Warneckia and some of the other African genera, one sees these strongly multinervate leaves that are reminiscent of other melastomes. And this could be a synapomorphy for the family as a whole that's been subsequently lost in some of the descendant lineages, like Memphis, like Muriri in tropical America. But this is kind of an introductory talk. And if you want a more analytical talk about possible synapomorphies for the family and so on, I'll have to come again another time. So where do these elisbioids go in the phylogeny? So what I'm showing you here is an unpublished supermatrix maximum likelihood tree. This is an analysis that's being led by Darren Pennies, and a number of us are involved with this. And it's still unpublished. In some previous analyses, the elisbioids were considered to be a sister family to the Melastomataceae, but the relationships really hinge on where does this small group from Southeast Asia called Turnandra, where do those plants go? And in this current analysis and in some others that have been recently published, Turnandra and the elisbioids are coming out strongly supported as sister lineages. And then that group is in turn sister to the rest of the family with all of its huge diversity. And so I think there's a growing consensus now that the classification of the family should include 3 subfamilies. This small one for Turnandra that has to be called Kibesioideae, and then the Elisbioideae as another subfamily, and then this hugely diverse Melastomatoideae with 21 tribes and more than 5,000 species. So this just shows the pantropical distribution of the elisbioids, and the density of dots is a little bit misleading, because in tropical America and also in Asia, what are shown here are just type localities for species, and in Africa it's all collections. And but you get a sense that this group occurs pretty much wherever it's tropical, with wide disjunctions across the oceans. And that's what led me into studying this group initially, one of the reasons. This is a summary of a maximum likelihood analysis of cloned sequences from the nuclear GAPC gene. I published this back in 2006. And according to this hypothesis, there are 6 monophyletic groups that are consistent with previously recognized genera based on morphology. And according to this hypothesis, Memisilon and Spathandra are sister groups. There's a monophyletic group consisting of Muriri and Vodomita in tropical America. And then Lindenia and Warneckia are sister groups. Just to summarize the diversity then, we have 2 genera that are widespread in the old world tropics. That would be Memisilon and Lindenia, but notice the difference in species richness in these 2 groups. So Memisilon is hugely rich with, I think it's coming close to 400 species now by my accounting. And then Lindenia, on the other hand, has a similarly wide distribution, but is very poor in species, almost a relictual kind of distribution. There's the big genus Muriri in tropical America, and then this much smaller and very enigmatic group, Votomita. And then we have 2 African genera, the monospecific Spathandra, and then Warneckia with around 50 species currently described. And this last group, Warneckia, also gets over to Madagascar, and there's 1 species on Mauritius. So this is an outgroup rooted maximum likelihood analysis of rDNA sequences from Memisilon. I published this in 2014. And you can see that the geographical areas occupied by the terminals are color-coded. So Western and Central Africa are in blue, East Africa in red, Madagascar in yellow, and Asia in green. And you can see here that there are 2 subclades from Western and Central Africa that are not each other's closest relatives. And one of these Western and Central African groups that I recognized as a subgenus, Muririoidea, is strongly supported as the sister to the remaining diversity. There are also 2 separate East African subclades, one of which extends to Southern Africa and disjunctly to Western and Northern Madagascar. That would be the section Buxifolia. There is also 1 species-rich subclade occurring exclusively in Madagascar and in the neighboring Comoro and Mascarene Islands. Focusing in on the African subclades of Memisilon, subgenus Memisilon, you can see that representatives of the Western and Central African subclade, those dots are shown in black, and representatives of the East African subclade are shown in red. In the previous slide, the phylogeny, I showed you that these are these 2 groups are not very closely related to each other. And the Western and Central African subclade is very widely distributed from the extreme western part of the continent all the way towards the east, but then it never quite makes it to the coast of the Indian Ocean. And there it's replaced by this other group. And then I've also mapped in yellow the distribution of section Buxifolia. This group is phylogenetically nested within the East African subclade, but it seems to have adaptations for somewhat drier climates. And so it's managed to find its way southward, even as far south as 32 degrees south in South Africa. And then it occurs disjunctly in these dry forests of western and northern Madagascar. Yeah. Oh, and in general, these two clades are separated by what's been called the East African arid corridor, which extends roughly from the Horn of Africa, Somalia area in the northeastern part of the continent in a southwesterly direction towards the Kalahari Desert. So you get the idea that this might be an ancient split. Just a little bit more about the environment in East Africa. So here we are fairly close to the coast in Kenya. And you can see that in the lowlands, there's this kind of semi-arid or subtropical bush or thicket kind of vegetation. And it's definitely not forest. So, and yet we're basically right on the equator. So East Africa is a relatively dry climate for being on the equator. That's the point. And yet we have these Inselbergs that poke up here and there. And there are patches of forest up on these hills, on these high hills, but they're isolated. And here's another one of these isolated hills, the Taita Hills. Where's Memphis in this arrangement? It's up there in that cloud forest on the top. So there's a persistent kind of rainforest environment. That's where these plants are found. Part of my work has been alpha taxonomic. I'm basically finding new species everywhere I look, in the field, in the herbarium, and so on. 46 of these have been described to date, mainly from Madagascar, but also from Cameroon, Mozambique, South Africa, Tanzania, and so on. And yeah, it's time-consuming work, as many of you know, and I hope I can get some more of them out one of these days. Just to show you some examples of these novelties, this is Memphis rheophyticum from Cameroon. Lindenia darainensis from Madagascar. And here are two novelties in Warneckia. On the left is Warneckia mashuali from Madagascar. Notice something about the flowers here. So some of the flowers are open and some are still in bud with the corolla not yet open, and yet the style is protruding from the unopened corolla. So it looks as if these plants might be, the flowers might be protogynous. And you see this in other species of Warneckia and also in species of Lindenia, which I showed you earlier are in that hypothesis. It looks like those two genera are sisters to each other. So this character of styles protruding from unopened corollas might be a synapomorphy for that little clade. And then on the right, you see Warneckia parvifolia. This photograph was taken from Mozambique, and I can tell you from experience that these fruits are delicious. So a little bit more about the diversity in Madagascar. What I've done here is I've plotted number of Memphis species on the y-axis versus land area on the x-axis. And I'm using the Asian diversity as kind of a reference point. So on the one hand, a smaller area, Borneo, there are 27 species of Memphis recorded from that island. And then in the Asian tropics as a whole, it's 143 species. And then I've just drawn a line between those 2 points. Maybe I'm not doing this right. Maybe somebody can correct me, but anyway, it's a point of departure anyway. And what I'm trying to get to is that if you look at this line, tropical Africa is below it and Madagascar is above it. So tropical Africa on the one hand has a much larger area of habitat, and yet the number of species in this genus is below the line. And then Madagascar on the other hand has a much smaller area of habitat, and yet there's this huge diversity that's almost kind of off the charts. So the conclusion is that something has amazing after this lineage arrived in Madagascar. Here I'm plotting collections of Memphis on the island of Madagascar. You don't really need statistics to understand that this is a non-random distribution, but it makes more sense when the dots are superimposed on a bioclimatic map of Madagascar. You can see that most of the dots are concentrated along the eastern coast. This is the most tropical part, the rainforest part of Madagascar, where the weather comes in off the Indian Ocean. And then there's a big escarpment, and shown in blue across the central part of the island, that's a high plateau that's quite a bit drier. And Memphis also occurs there, but only in scattered localities. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain species that occur in these dry forests in the west and north. The area is shown in green. You can see the southern part of the island is south of 20 degrees, so it's actually outside of the tropics. And once you get to the southwestern part of the island, it's semi-arid, kind of spiny thicket vegetation, and the genus is almost completely absent from that part of the island. This is a plot of cumulative number of species over time, and this tracks the rate of species description on Madagascar in this genus, and you can see that the rate, although somewhat episodic, is also kind of linear, more or less. But then the other point is that a lot of the recently collected material from Missouri Botanical Garden and others, a lot of that material seems to be undescribed, most of it even, and a lot of really rare species as well. So that's what I'm busy. I'm busy working with that material, and assuming that I can get it done, it's going to increase the total number of known species in this genus on Madagascar by 100% in comparison to the last revision that was published in 1985. Not that long ago, but it's just a reminder of the amazing diversity in Madagascar, most of which are localized endemics. If you plot a histogram of the number of species versus the number of known sites, you can see that the majority of species are known from just 1 or 2 sites, indicating a predominant pattern of local endemism. And there are relatively few species that are widely distributed on the island. And there's also extreme morphological diversity, more so than anywhere else in the old world distribution of the genus. You have on the one hand species like Memphis xiphophilum with these large sword-like leaves, almost 1/2 meter long. And then another species not yet described that has these very minute leaves and everything in between. Another remarkable fact is that there seems to be convergence in vegetative morphology in different species, and this has led to taxonomic confusion. So there are several examples of this, but in this particular one, these are 2 collections from the same locality in a littoral forest along the eastern coast. The one on the left is the holotype of Memphis infuscatum, and then on the right, this is a species I recently described called Memphis convergens. They're, as you can see, they're very similar vegetatively, and in fact, these collections that I described as convergens were placed with in the circumscription of this other species, but with further work, it was discovered that the fruits are very well. One has very small berries, and the other one has large, and then the flowers are also different. They're really quite different. So now I'd like to talk about our collaborative work on the African members of tribe Melastomataceae. This was work done by Marie Claire, started when she was a PhD student, and it's been ongoing. She and Gudrun were, as you know, were based in Mainz, but they've recently relocated to Munich. So the background to this is that in Africa, the family are mainly represented by the tribe Melastomataceae, previously with about 13 genera and 185 species. And within this, Desotis, with about 120 species, was the largest genus in the tribe, the largest African genus. But its delimitation and the infrageneric classification had remained controversial. So this was the entry into this. When Bentham first described the genus Desotis, it was based on a single species, the West African Desotis grandiflora. This was said to differ from Osbeckia chiefly by having stamens dimorphic. And you can see here in the West African grandiflora, the anthers of the external whorl have the connective greatly elongated at the base. The controversy is centered on whether Osbeckia is strictly Asian or whether its circumscription should include certain forms in Africa with isomorphic stamens. Some other examples, some other remarkable examples of the diversity in this African Melastomataceae group. This is Nerophila genchinoides. It's an annual from West Africa with yellow flowers. There are not many yellow flowered melastomes in Africa, and not many annuals either. So this species is remarkable for 2 reasons. But it had not been seen for many, many years. And it was also thought for a long time to belong to a South American genus Chaetolepis. It does resemble Chaetolepis, but Marie Claire's molecular results squarely place this plant in the African Melastomataceae in the Disotis and allies clade. And another remarkable rediscovery is this shrub, Kaliela. So this is a monospecific lineage in West Africa. It hadn't been seen since 1937 when the type collection was made. And then it was discovered by some Kew botanists a few years back. It's extremely rare, but a very nice find nonetheless. Here I'm showing you results from a combined analysis of rDNAs and two plastid regions. I can't really, you probably can't see this too well. Here's some more detail from these results on the Disotis and allies clade. But if I can just summarize the major results for you here, they show that the old world Melastomataceae are monophyletic, and that the Asian and Madagascar endemic subclades are phylogenetically nested amongst the African lineages. And then of the African genera, there are only two, Tristemma and Dichetanthera, as previously circumscribed, that are monophyletic, in addition to Kaliela and Pseudosbeckia that are monospecific. And then importantly, Disotis, Heterotis, and Antheratoma, as previously circumscribed, are polyphyletic. Another important result bears on this question about staminal dimorphism and if it's a taxonomically useful character. This may be hard to read as well, but the terminals on this tree are coded in different colors depending on whether their stamens are isomorphic or dimorphic. And what you can see here, I hope, is that there's just a tremendous amount of homoplasy. In other words, this is not a useful character at all on which to base a classification. So the taxonomic conclusions from this work, the major ones: Disotis sensulatu is a waste bin taxon lacking any consistently diagnostic characters. Subclades within Disotis and allies are morphologically well defined and should be recognized as separate genera. Our proposed generic realignment of African Melastomataceae should be more practical and predictive in the future. And this revised classification will appear in a forthcoming family treatment for the flora of Central Africa. This generic realignment includes 8 newly recognized genera of African Melastomataceae. The first is Almeidanthus, named in honor of Frank Almeida of California Academy of Sciences. Then there's Anaheterotis, Disododendron, which was originally described as a subgenus of Disotis and has been elevated. Then there's Eleotis, Feliciotis, named in honor of Monsieur Jacques Félix, a famous African melastomatologist. Nothodisotis, Pyrotis, and then last but not least, Rosettia. Rosettia is named in honor of Rosette Fernandez, part of the dynamic duo of Abilio and Rosette Fernandez, the Portuguese melastomatologists. And of course, we haven't tied everything up, so there are some further study needs. in the African Melastomataceae, there are some lineages that remain unsampled. One of these being Dionicastrum, monospecific genus known only from the Uluguru Mountains in Tanzania, and also Disotis leonensis from West Africa. And also please stay tuned for new results on African members of tribe Sonorilii. Thanks very much for your kind attention this morning.
Thank you, Doug. That's great. Man, so we'll open it up now for questions. If anybody wants to talk, just let me know. I think I should be able to liberate everybody to just unmute, but if you can't, just put your name on the chat and then I will unmute you if that's the case, but I think everybody can unmute themselves. I will throw in two quick questions, Doug. One is, so you're more than doubling the number of species on Memphis Island in Madagascar. Is this a unique thing, or is that seen in the other groups of melastomes that we have not, you didn't discuss today, like in the Sonorilii? And what about outside the Melastomataceae?
Yeah, well, this pattern of local endemism that I described has happened independently in a number of different lineages on Madagascar. So I think if somebody could explain how that has happened, they would be famous. But so that's a general pattern that demands an explanation. And then within the melastomes, there's another genus called Gravesia that has also gone just completely crazy in Madagascar, but those are not woody plants.
And another question I had was, when Lindenia was reestablished, if I remember correctly, one of the things that Bremer looked at were the fact that some of them were dioecious. Has that been looked at more closely, or what is the story of dioece within the Olisbioideae?
All right, so the type species of Lindenia is Lindenia laurina. That's the Asian species, or one of the Asian species. And as far as I know, that's the only one. When it was originally described, it was described as being dioecious. I think it's androdioecious, but it's the only one. So as far as I know, that characteristic is not more widespread.
Any other questions here? I don't want to hug. I could ask Doug questions for 40 minutes.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks for the great talk. I loved how you in the beginning showed a bit about the sort of biogeographic distribution of the different species and species diversity and so on. And then, I mean, obviously my view is very Andean biased, but there's all this work about how Andes, so the uplift of the Andes has driven the diversification of many different plant lineages, not only Melastomataceae. And now I know very little about Africa, to be honest, but from your pictures, I got the feeling that there are many mountains as well. And I was wondering, what do you think about, well, maybe drought events or like dry habitats, but also mountains in Africa as drivers of diversification in these lineages?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and I think you're pointing to drought is very important. If you compare the tropical regions of the world in terms of their plant diversity, Africa has been described as sort of the odd man out, if you will. So if you, it's certainly rich, but not not so much so in comparison to the plant diversity in tropical America or also the Asian tropics. And then if you look at the climatic patterns, the tropical Africa is indeed tropical, but of all the tropical regions, it also has the most strongly developed dry season. So it's really only tropical for maybe part of the year, at least in many areas. So yeah, a dry climate has certainly shaped the diversity patterns that we see. And then there are certain pockets or concentrations of species richness. Cameroon especially is rich in Memphis and also in other melastomes. And I think that's not an accident, because there are these mountains in Cameroon that seem to have acted as refugia at various times. And so that's another interesting way to look at the diversity, is in terms of these refuges, climatic refuges, if you will.
So Doug, I had a question about, in general, the diversity in the Lesbioides and Memphis. So Memphis kind of seems to be like the Myconi of the Lesbioides, right? Memphis with so many species. What do you think might be driving the overall species diversity in Memphis as compared to other, major clades within the Lesbioides?
Yeah, that's another really good question. My answer would be pretty speculative, I think. I mentioned that the fruits are berry-like. And I think I showed a slide where of a transverse section of a Memphis berry, showing the embryo inside with these very large and convoluted cotyledons packed inside. You don't see those really extensive leafy cotyledons in the other Memphis genera. I don't know for sure at all, but I'm speculating that one of the reasons why Memphis has diversified more than these others is that it's been able to persist in new areas, because once it colonizes, and that these very leafy cotyledons may have helped it in this business of persisting in newly inhabited areas. Pure speculation, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Super interesting. I find it fascinating.
Me too.
Any other questions?
Yes, can you guys hear me? Sorry, I'm having problems with the internet today, so that's why you can see me.
We can hear you, Nico, though.
Okay, wonderful. Doug, thank you so much for a very nice talk. What do you make of the diversity in Sri Lanka? We were there together, and we sort of figured out that there are a number of unknown entities there too. Do you draw any kind of similarity between what might be going on in Sri Lanka versus what might be going on in Madagascar?
Well, there are undescribed species in this group everywhere. It's just, like I said, when I started, I was really naive. I was actually, I was interested in biogeography. I noticed that there was not a comprehensive monograph for this group, but there were recent sort of regional treatments of one kind or another. And I thought, oh, this is absolutely great. I can use the existing classification to design a sampling strategy. and then use that to add a nice phylogenetic and biogeographical study on top of it all. And basically, this is great. All the species problems are solved. Not so what's going on in Sri Lanka, I think, is completely consistent with what's happening elsewhere. And I think that's the part of the reason why Africa shows up as below the line in terms of diversity is that there's still lots to discover. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yes, it is. Sometimes I wonder whether the diversity is driven also from the fact that Memphis maybe does so well in very dry habitats. And some of these regions are known for these very dry patches. And I see that almost as a common theme on Memphis Island, but that's just, again, it's untested probably. So
yeah, well, it's true. There are some species in Sri Lanka that get into much drier kinds of forest.
yeah.
And that pattern is repeated in parts of Africa as well. It's true. But I think the group has its roots in really wet forest.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Any others? Any questions? There was a question on the chat from Julie Denslow, but it was similar to what you already talked about. One of the previous questions. Any other questions before we thank Doug again?
I have another question. I hope my notes are correct, but I think I wrote down that Borneo has relatively few species compared to Madagascar in Memphis, if that's true. And so I was wondering why. You have any ideas? I mean, maybe the dry wet thing again that you discussed just before. It's just surprising.
Yeah, it is surprising. I don't think it's that Borneo is poor. I think there's probably more diversity in Borneo than is reflected in the numbers that we have right now. That's one thing I could say. But the other thing is I've already tried to show what's happened with this group in Madagascar is just completely almost off the chart. And so there's been this extensive radiation, not only in the very wet eastern rainforest, but then there are these really interesting pockets of diversity in what I call these transitional forests on the extreme north of the island and also on the extreme south, where these are areas where the climate is changing from the ever wet along the eastern escarpment, and it's changing towards drier situations, and you get lots of endemics in those transitional forests as well. So that's probably part of the explanation of what's driving this on Madagascar.
We have another question, and it's not coming from Vinny or Agnes. Julie wants to know, what do you know about pollinators? You speculated about the oil gathering bees, but yeah.
We know virtually nothing. So there's been a pollination study on one species of muriri in South America. I think there may have been some other pollination work done on muriri, but I'm not sure. But with the old world diversity, basically nothing is known. And it's all for the future. That would be really interesting. When I was really in South Africa, I was living in a country that had Memphis, so I was thinking, this is great. Let me try to find some students who would like sit for hours and hours, but it didn't happen.
Can I ask you a question? This is Renato talking.
Go ahead, Dr. Goldenberg.
You showed a picture of Memphis, and the thing that I don't know these plants in the field, but I have seen Moriri in South America. And one thing that is very different from Moriri is that the stamens are presented with the dorsal gland upwards. How can I say, the direction of the presentation of the anther is different from Moriri, because in Moriri, the glands stay, let's say, extrarsally from the dorsal glands. The way that the stamens are presented, they stay below the anther, not above the anther, like in Memphis. Do you have an idea? Is that true? Is that first of all, am I right?
Well, you know, I did not know that characteristic about Moriri until now. So that would be an interesting thing to look into, I would think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is something new. We should talk about that.
Yes, probably. Yeah, it would be a nice thing to investigate, you know, because the way the glands are presented for the pollinators is completely different between that Memphis and Moriri.
Wow.
Oh, thank you very much. No.
That's very interesting. The other thing I could add to that is that I forgot to mention that this curious gland on the anther connective, it's been lost apparently multiple times independently, and so we don't really know if it's something that maybe is this character is maybe the ghost of a past pollinator that is no longer existing, or if there's some kind of shifting of pollinators going on. But yeah, and there's a strong phylogenetic signal for this loss of the gland in these different descendant lineages.
Okay, so it seems one more question going once, going twice. This was awesome. Oh, okay, Agnes. Sorry.
No, a short one. Have you ever seen nectar in the flowers? Like if you have glands that probably produce oils, have you ever seen flowers that also have nectar?
No.
No. Okay. That was a short question.
Yeah.
No, this is great. These are all good, especially because we know so little about them, and Doug is the person who has seen the most amount of species in the field for sure in this group. No, I mean, maybe by orders of magnitude for the person that's in the second amount of species. So next month we'll have Klaus Lunau giving a talk in 4 weeks. We'll be circulating the link for all of that, and they will be posting this talk in the next day or so on YouTube, and we'll send an email about that for everyone and post. Thank you, Doug. This is amazing, and thank you, everyone. Again, I want to remind everyone, if you want to give a talk, don't be shy. If you think you don't have a lot, if you have a 15-minute talk only, that's fine too. We'll take it. We as you see, everybody wants to learn about these plants, and we're a very eager and chill audience. Thank you, Doug.
It's
Thank
a pleasure.
you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.